A number of years ago, there was a man by the name of Judas who lived in the city of San Francisco. Now, I don't know Judas. In fact, I know basically nothing about him. I don't know anything about his background or his family or what he did or what he does. But I know one very, very simple thing, and that is this: that Judas made a mistake. I don't even know necessarily the nature of that mistake. I just know that it was bad. So bad, in fact, that Judas felt like he had to go. He had to leave. Leaving family, leaving friends, to go and to just get away. He had left relationships ruptured and friendships fractured, and he could not stay. And I don't know about you, but maybe that's where you find yourself today. You feel like a relationship or a friendship or something has been fractured or broken to the point that it is time to go. Maybe it's a spouse or a friend or a colleague or a coworker, but you feel that deep pit in your stomach. Well, today, we've come to the third part of a three-part series, a series that has been preached over the course of the last couple of weeks, where we're answering a question. What do you do, or what do God's people do when the worst happens? 2 weeks ago, Pastor Philip stood right here and he answered that question. What do God's people do when the worst happens? Well, they cling to hope. They cling to faith. And then Pastor Carl was here last week and asked the question, what do God's people do when the worst happens? And he said, they cling to hope. Well, today we're going to ask the same question. What do we do? What do you do when the worst happens? Perhaps you're in a marriage and you have found that your spouse has broken that deep-seated trust in those vows of a marriage, and you don't know what to do next. Or maybe it's a colleague, a coworker, someone who has done some shady and maybe even unethical things that have put you in a real tough spot, and you're not sure how to handle that situation. Or maybe it's something else altogether. It's a friend, someone close, who has done something to you. They were supposed to come through, and they didn't do it. And now you're left kind of grasping at straws, and you don't know what to do. The trust is broken. The relationship is fractured. You are not sure how to handle that or what to do next. Well, if you're there, take courage, for you are not alone. Maybe that's you in your marriage, in your friendship, at work, at home, in a classroom. So if you think about yourself in any of these given situations and you feel like you are sitting there today, you are not alone, because in fact, we're going to read today about Jesus and a place where Jesus encountered this very same type of situation, a situation of broken trust, a situation of betrayal, where he had to deal with some people in his life who were close to him and did something that absolutely broke the relationships they had with him. In fact, we're going to open to the text in the Gospel of John, chapter 13. We encounter Jesus here on the last night of his life. He has lived all of his ministry. He has essentially nothing left to do. We find him here at the Last Supper. We find him in that situation of betrayal and of broken trust. And here is what happens. We'll begin in verse 18. And Jesus says the following: I am not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. Very truly, I tell you, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. So here we are. Jesus is feeling the betrayal that is coming. And I'm sure that many of you are likely familiar with the story. You know who is going to betray him. You know what is coming. But this isn't the only thing. You see, as if it was not bad enough that one person is going to betray him, a second person is going to betray him here. We're just going to go a little bit further down in the chapter to read of a second instance of a second person who is going to do something kind of in a similar vein here. We'll this time begin reading in the same chapter, John 13, verse 36. And the text says, Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus replied, where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. The year was 1536, and a reformer by the name of William Tyndale was on the run. Tyndale was on the run from the crown in England for committing a crime. His crime, you ask? The simple crime of translating the Bible into English. Tyndale, in fact, would be the first to translate it into English primarily using the original Hebrew and Greek text that had been discovered at that time. But there was Tyndale. He was on the run. He was trying to avoid certain torture and death. He had made his way to Antwerp, Belgium, where he had found some English merchants whom he could trust. He was there with them. He was hiding out. They were keeping his location and the fact that he was there a secret. He was staying with a gentleman by the name of Thomas Poyntz. And Tyndale and Poyntz, they lived there together. They were in communion with these English merchants and in communication with them as well. And things were good. Well, not too long thereafter, another man showed up. His name, Henry Phillips. And he became fast friends with the merchants and Poyntz and Tyndale. But unbeknownst to them, Phillips was also in trouble. You see, the crown wanted him too, because he had taken a lot of money that wasn't his and gambled it away and lost it all. And therefore, the crown wanted him as well. He was also in big trouble. So there they were. Well, it came to a point where Poyntz needed to take care of some business. He was going to be away for a month or so. So he got up, he left, he went to take care of his business away from Antwerp somewhere. And Phillips had been in communication with agents of the crown, of the King of England. You see, they had offered him a lot of money to betray Tyndale to the crown, because Tyndale was the one they wanted. He was the one they were really after. And so Phillips, being in such dire financial straits with no money and no way to really make money, accepted. So Poyntz went on business, and Phillips decided to put his plan into action. He made the 18-mile ride from his residence to Antwerp, to where Tyndale lived, and he brought some officers with him. But he needed a ruse, so he approached Tyndale and asked him to lunch. He said, let's go, let's have some lunch, and Tyndale graciously obliged. Well, they got ready and they were going to head out, and as they were heading out, he asked Tyndale for a little bit of money. He said, I've forgotten my purse, I lost it. Could you loan me a little bit of money? And Tyndale, of course, kindly said yes. He said, here you go, here's a little bit to hold you over. And then they were headed out. Well, the streets in Antwerp, Belgium are very narrow. The alleyways are hard to get through, to a point where sometimes 2 people can't walk next to each other. And that's kind of how it was near where Tyndale lived. So they go out to exit the door opens, and Phillips, being polite, says, go right ahead. And so Tyndale exits the door, and as he exits, he looks out, and he sees the officers standing there. And immediately, Tyndale knows what's going on. So Tyndale does everything he can. He tries to retreat back into the home, but Phillips was standing there behind him. And Phillips pushed him out into the street. They tied him up, took him away. Word was sent to Poyntz, who was away, and he made his way back as quickly as he could and begged for Tyndale's life. But by then, it was too little, too late. In early October of 1536, Tyndale would be condemned of heresy and burned at the stake. It would be only a few short months later, in 1537, when King Henry VIII, the King of England at the time, would decree in England that the Bible be translated to English. And you know what they did? They used Tyndale's translation work and called it good. You know, I wasn't there, and I'm not Tyndale. I can't read his mind. But if I were him, and I were to have the opportunity to face Henry Phillips, I might ask, why? I thought we were friends. I know you needed money, and I loaned it to you. How could you sell me out like this? Why would you betray me? But the truth is, that's not quite the question we're asking today. We've all experienced that kind of sense of betrayal somewhere, somehow, with someone. We all know what that feels like to varying degrees. The question we're going to ask today is, how do we deal with that? How do we respond? And I think the answer is something we can find when we return to the text here. In fact, sandwiched between the two texts we've already read, we might find the answer. We're going to read again, this time Jesus' words, in verses 34 and 35. He says this, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Well, okay, Jesus. So you tell me that when I have been betrayed and trodden down, the answer to that is to love the other person. And I don't know about you, but respectfully, Lord, I find that a little bit unsatisfying. But I think Jesus might look at me and say, okay, I understand. But listen to me, if you will. Give me a moment or two. You see, I have told you to love regardless. When you have been betrayed, that ought to be your response. But I also want to give you a little bit of practical information, practical knowledge. And so you can navigate these kind of difficult waters when you're in that situation, when someone has broken your trust. And I say, okay then, I suppose I'm ready. Lay it on me. And Jesus says three things I want you to remember. Number one, feel the feelings. Okay, feel the feelings, Jesus. What does that mean? Well, he might say, I know you better than you know yourself, and I have been observing you. And when it comes to feelings, there might be a thing or two that you could learn. I have observed you, says Jesus, at work. And at work, you tend to handle issues and conflicts in a fairly decent manner. You've got a problem, you've got a set of things you must do to solve the problem, a list of tasks, you check them off, and then you find a solution. And you handle it fairly methodically, even robotically, one might say. And you find the issue, you find the solution. Problem, solution. But, Jesus says, I've also noticed that this is kind of a modus operandi, if you will, that you've tried to apply to your marriage. And it doesn't always work quite as well in that context. You see, sometimes when you run into conflict and you run into issues, the other person just wants to be heard and wants their feelings to be validated. Feel the feelings, says Jesus. Don't just try to power right through it. When there is conflict, when someone has wronged you, when you have wronged someone else, feel the feelings. Don't push them down. Don't ignore them. And I say, okay, Lord, I'll try to take that one to heart. What else do you have for me? And he says, okay, number two, name the problem. When you come to a situation where there is conflict, where someone has done something wrong to you, name the problem. Jesus says, imagine What if you one day were to go to the doctor? The doctor was to run some tests on you and was to find out that you had cancer. And then they were to come back to you and say, well, everything looks good, you're fine. They didn't want to offend you, so they didn't name the problem. That's ridiculous. No one would do that to you. Or maybe you're getting ready for a cross-country road trip. So you take your car to the mechanic to do a little checkup, make sure the oil is filled, make sure the engine is good, make sure everything is ready to go. And the mechanic gets the car, takes a look at it, and notices a small crack beginning to form in the engine block. Takes the car down, gives it back to you, and says, it's ready, 2,000 plus miles, no problem. No mechanic would do that to you. They would name the problem. They wouldn't be afraid of offending you. So when you come to a situation, when you come to a place where someone has done something to make something wrong with you, name the problem, says Jesus. Don't just let it be water under the bridge. Don't just ignore it. It's important that you name what is there. Well, okay then, Jesus, I understand that. So feel the feelings you're saying, name the problem you say. Well, what's the third thing you want me to do? Well, says Jesus, here's what I want you to do. I want you to build them a golden bridge of retreat. And I would respond to Jesus and I would say, well, that's an interesting choice of words you use there, because that is actually a choice of words that's very familiar to me. It's something I've heard before. A couple of years ago, I took a class entitled Leadership by Dr. Scott Cormode at Fuller Theological Seminary. And it was a great class. And part of the class was memorizing certain terms for different things that we had to learn. And this particular term I remember having to memorize because it had to do a lot with conflict resolution. And as Dr. Cormode taught it, he said, build them a golden bridge to retreat. Inevitably, you're going to run into a situation at some point where you're right and the other person is wrong. And the hope is that they say, I'm wrong, it's okay, you move forward. But the reality is that doesn't always happen. Usually, people will get backed into a corner and then they will fight, even when they are wrong, because they have nothing left to fight for but their dignity. So Dr. Cormode would say, build them a golden bridge of retreat. Allow them to save face and dignity even when they are wrong. Because if you try to hammer your point home, no matter how right it is, you will destroy the relationship. Well, Jesus says, I think you understand what I'm saying. You've got to feel the feelings. You've got to name the problem, and you've got to build them a golden bridge of retreat. Well, okay, Jesus. Once again, I understand what you're saying, but respectfully, did you do this? Because I hear this advice and I hear the recommendations, but I want to know if this is the way you treated the people in your life when they betrayed you. And the thing is, we can look, we can check your work, and we can read your actions. Did you follow your own advice, Jesus? Well, to find the answer to that, we must return to the text. So the first thing he says is what? He says, feel the feelings. So I'm going to reread one very short phrase from the text we've already read. It's in verse 21, it says, after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified. And I know it's easy to miss, but there is one small phrase in there I want you to hear very clearly. Jesus was troubled in spirit. Jesus did not push the feelings down. He did not try to get away from what was happening. Jesus felt the feelings. He was troubled in spirit. He knew what was coming with Judas. He knew what was coming with Peter, and he didn't ignore his feelings. He felt them. But it doesn't stop there, because there's a second thing, remember? Did he name the problem? Well, to answer that, we return to the text once again. This time we'll read in John chapter 13, starting in verse 22. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. So Jesus told him, "What you're about to do, do quickly." So what does he do here with Judas? He names the problem. He speaks to him directly. Judas and Jesus both are very well aware of what is going on here. There is no miscommunication. Jesus names the problem. And then he does the same thing with Peter. Down in verse 38, "Will you really lay down your life for me?" Jesus asks. "Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Just like with Judas, he does the same with Peter. There is no miscommunication. Peter and Jesus are very clear on the message that has been communicated. So what does Jesus do? First, he feels the feelings. Then he names the problem. But then we come to our third piece. Does Jesus build a golden bridge of retreat? Does he? And if he does, how does he do it? Well, once again, we return to the text. Verse 28. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him, referring to what Jesus had said to Judas. Since Judas had charged the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Now, when we read this text, it's easy to assume that what Jesus said to Judas is a very obvious sign or marker of what's happening. But then you notice something strange. If you continue reading into the portion of the text I just read, the other disciples are confused. They don't know what's happened. They think Judas has gone out to buy stuff for the poor or buy supplies for later in the festival. They clearly are unaware of the conversation. And to understand why, allow me to speak to you for a moment about the Last Supper and what's going on here. You see, when they had the Last Supper, they don't all sit in chairs around a table like we would today for lunch or dinner. They don't even all sit on one side of the table like the Da Vinci painting would suggest. What actually happened is they would have all gathered around kind of a raised platform just a little bit off the floor, and they would have all laid down around it, each person kind of reclining into the chest of the person on their left. So here's what we've got. We don't know what order most of them are kind of reclining in, but we do know for a few of them. We know John is reclining into Jesus. So he is on Jesus' right, reclining right into Jesus' chest. Then we have Jesus, the host, who is reclining into Judas' chest, who is on his left. And that is a place of very high honor to have the host recline into you. So as you can imagine, if your head is that close to another person's head, it's not hard to have a secret conversation. It's not hard to whisper and kind of chat back and forth without everybody else hearing what you're saying. And so that's what happens here. Jesus and Judas have a very short conversation. And in that, Jesus gives Judas an out. He doesn't humiliate him in front of all of his friends. He doesn't embarrass him in front of the rest of the disciples. He says, listen, what you're going to do it quickly. But you still have a chance to change your mind. And if you do, I'm not going to tell everybody else what you've done. I'm going to forgive you and let it go. I'm going to build you a golden bridge of retreat so you can still save face in front of all of our friends. So that's what Jesus does. He does the 3 things. He feels the feelings. Jesus was troubled in spirit. He speaks, he names the problem. He says, Judas, you're going to betray me. He says, Peter, you're going to disown me. And then finally, he builds a golden bridge of retreat. He says, listen, I'm not going to out you in front of all these people, despite the fact that you've done something wrong. Well, we all know what happens. Judas feels tremendous guilt and remorse. And if you go into the Gospel of Matthew, you can read what he does. He feels so much guilt and remorse, in fact, that he commits suicide because he cannot live with what he has done once he realizes it. But the story for Peter isn't quite over yet. We can read the rest of that story. He'll go on that fateful night, and he will indeed deny Jesus 3 times. And then the rooster will crow, and the text says there in the Gospel of Matthew, Peter went outside and wept bitterly. Because Jesus is then marched up a hill to Calvary. He is crucified on a cross. He is given as a sacrifice for Judas, for Peter, for you, and for me. And then he will lay in a tomb for 3 days. And what is probably the darkest days this world has ever known. But then on the 3rd day, he will rise again, and he will have an appointment with Peter. You can go look in John 21 and read the account. He will ask Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And Peter will respond in kind 3 times as well, and he will say, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord. I love you. And Jesus will build him that golden bridge of retreat and welcome him right back into the fold. And he will say, listen, you are forgiven. I still felt the feelings, and I still named the problem with you. But I forgive you because I want you here. So today, in your life, one of you somewhere is dealing with the feeling of betrayal. A friend, a family member, a coworker, brother, sister, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, I don't know who. But it's probably someone in your life. Someone who has done something that has broken that trust down. Don't hesitate to feel the feelings because they are valid. Jesus felt them, and so we should too. But don't forget to name the problem because you can't just ignore it and just let it go without naming it. Otherwise, there is no chance for an authentic relationship. And then thirdly, have some grace. And don't forget to build that golden bridge of retreat. Remember Judas? Not Judas Iscariot, but Judas from San Francisco. The one I know basically nothing about. Well, I read about him, just a couple of sentences, a few phrases, in a book entitled Judas and Jesus, written by Ray Anderson. And in the preface, Anderson writes about Judas. Anderson says that he was eating at a restaurant one day in San Francisco when he went to use the restroom. And he used the restroom and he washed his hands and he looked at the mirror in front of him. And on the mirror in front of him was something written in large block letters with a felt tip pen. And it just said, Judas, come home. All is forgiven. So, when you encounter that person in your life this week, and you felt the feelings, you've named the problem, you've built a golden bridge of retreat, hopefully you're ready to go into that bathroom like Jesus and write those words in big block letters so everyone can see. Judas, come home. All is forgiven.